So this year at Penobscot Marine Museum, we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of Roll and Go Songs of American Sailormen. It was compiled by Joanna Colcord. Although she was born at sea in 1882, Joanna had deep roots in Searsport and a life dedicated to her profession, her interest in maritime history and culture, and her family. The Penobscot Marine Museum archive has a wealth of documents written by or relating to Joanna Colcord. And in this talk, I will share documents that help to fill in the gaps between Joanna's public image and the person behind it. In addition to it being a trove of sea shanties collected in the first quarter of the 20th century, Roll and Go provides some information and mysteries about its author. And I have several copies, but this is one of my favorites because it is inscribed in the beginning, "Faithfully yours, Joanna C. Colcord," which is also the image you see in front of us, and we feature it in our exhibit. So we get to the acknowledgements page, and the book begins with acknowledgements, and along with shanty singers, authors, and publishers, Joanna thanks Governor George E. Beckwith of Sailors Snug Harbor for permission to reproduce several paintings from the collection of the institution. So we're looking at things and then we're gonna put things together as it goes along. So after the acknowledgements page, we get to an introduction that was written by Lincoln Colcord, and he was living in Searsport at the time. And that's her brother. And he went by Link in the family, and they called Joanna Nan or Nanny. And after the introduction, we get to the illustrations. We get to a lot of information about the illustrations. There's a short essay, in fact. And the essay ends stating, "The originals of almost all of these pictures are to be found in the splendid collection at Sailors Snug Harbor, Staten Island, which seems to be unknown and as yet unvisited by the collectors. None of these pictures has ever been reproduced in the volumes of nautical literature known to the compiler, and there is no history at the harbor of their having been photographed before. Mainly the gifts of old sea captains and their families, they represent an accretion rather than a deliberate attempt at collecting special sorts of pictures. Everything is in there together, from old paintings on glass of the packet ship New Hampshire, now flaking away from its background, down to the battleships of the Spanish-American War, and in this mingling of good and bad, of oils, watercolors, old prints, and engravings, lies its special charm for the lover of ship pictures." So you're gonna see Snug Harbor coming up a few more times. This is the Harvard, which was the image included as the frontispiece. And Lincoln and Joanna wrote to each other constantly. And so we have this really cool record going back and forth. And they collaborated over long distances. First, Lincoln was in New York City and Joanna was up in Orono going to school. And then Lincoln moved to Searsport and then Joanna's down in New York City. So they're collaborating through letters over long distances with the very occasional telegram or maybe phone call interspersed. So, and they really relied on each other's opinions as they were going along. And they had strong opinions, especially Lincoln. And he said about the paintings, about the illustrations, "First, as to your news, it's fine that you have found such a mine of paintings and a great relief too, a stroke of luck in a way. In the meantime, you will have had my 2 packages, which aren't much, excepting the Harvard. And I'm not sure that will reproduce well, too much blackness. Your selection for the book sounds good as far as it goes, but aren't you to have more than 7? Seems to me there should be at least a dozen." So the Harvard did make it in. And I'm actually not sure where this image is today. It's room for further research because this one is not in our collection, so it might still be in a private collection, which is pretty cool. And Lincoln was doing his part in this effort. He was going around in Searsport and looking for pictures, for paintings and images that he thought should be included in Roll and Go, and writing to Joanna about them and trying to figure out how to get them photographed so they can be included in the book. So there was a list of illustrations, and as you see, there were a lot of details that were included. Lincoln felt it was very important to have the full captions under each picture. So it wasn't under the picture, but it is included in this list because he thought there needed to be the tonnage, dimensions, if obtainable, etc., everything of interest. And indeed, Joanna did include that information in the list of illustrations. Aside from the Harvard and the paintings from Sailor's Snug Harbor, Joanna included this image in the section about windlass or capstan chanteys. And she captioned it, "Heave a pawl, the anchor coming in to the tune of a capstan shanty." And this is a pretty cool picture, and it's one that we have in our photo archives. And this is a scan from the book, but this is the real image. And the quality of these images is so amazing, and we're able to zoom in and see so many details. We use this image when we're talking with little kids about life at sea and what do you see in this picture. And so here we do see the men pushing on the capstan bars, and the capstan is hidden right here, but we see at least 3 sets of men that are working it. It helps to bring to life Joanna's world and the music she is documenting, because as you're reading this book and you're reading these shanties, this is how they were used, and it puts sound to this image. It's also fascinating because Joanna was there on board this sailing vessel around 1900. She was listening to the songs of the sailors, and she was taking photographs of the things she saw. And the Penobscot Marine Museum now has a large collection of Joanna's photographs, plus professional and personal print materials, letters about collecting shanties, draft schoolwork, telegrams, notes, doodles, and they help us understand the person behind the book and the person behind the camera. A large portion of the collection is correspondence between Joanna and her brother Lincoln, or more accurately, we have Lincoln's side of the conversation. But these letters provide intimate insight into Joanna with details that aren't found elsewhere. Lincoln is an important part of Joanna's story, but this is, after all, Joanna's story, so I tried not to rely too heavily on him. So I'm not doing full biography in here, but I figure I should add in a little bit as well. So what was her early life like? Joanna spent her first year of life on board the bark Charlotte A. Littlefield, and she was born on there too. And we see a record of birth here that lists the latitude and longitude of her birth. Her father was Lincoln A. Colcord, a sea captain from Searsport, and Joanna's mother was Jane Sweetser, or Jeana Colcord, who accompanied her husband on a honeymoon voyage and returned home to Searsport 2 years later with 2 children. It was then fairly common for the wives and children of Maine merchant captains to go to sea with their husband or their father. After returning to Searsport, Joanna spent the next few years at home in Searsport. In 1889, when her parents and brother returned to sea, Joanna was left home with her grandmother, and this was also fairly common. They might leave one child home to attend school, and the other child might go with them, and then they would alternate. She returned to sea at 8 years old and spent the rest of her child alternating between Searsport and her father's sailing vessels. So here's a photograph of Joanna about 1890, and here we have Lincoln, and they're on board the Clara E. McGilvery in Boston. This document is included in Joanna's scrapbook, and that scrapbook is visible in the library, in the lobby of the PMM Library and Photo Archives. And this document, Joanna was only 10 years old when she lost her kitten. And it says, "In loving memory of Purr, was drowned in the Indian Ocean, July 4th, 1892, in her first year, lovely cat of Nanny Colcord." Years later, Joanna wrote, "Although it was seldom that peril actually threatened us, we knew the bright face of danger as an intimate and daily possibility. We knew why small boats were lashed to the top of the forward house and why they were always kept in readiness for use. We understand the law of circular storms and what a change of wind meant when a cyclone was somewhere in our neighborhood. The dread possibilities involved in a heavy fog when coming on the coast were not kept hidden from us. In this sense, we early learned to face realities, and our lives were not sheltered as are those of shore children. That's from Childhood at Sea that she wrote years later. So as I mentioned, in her late teens, Joanna took up photography, and she took this photo on board the ship State of Maine around 1900, and she has really a phenomenal collection that documents life at sea. Then in 1902, Joanna returned from her last voyage with her father and mother and enrolled at the University of Maine. And we have several of her college essays and German assignments in the Penobscot Marine Museum archives. This essay, written in 1902, entitled Up from the Southward, showcases her ability to capture her thoughts in writing and her deep love and understanding of the sea. So I invite you to close your eyes as you listen to this essay and imagine the picture that Joanna paints. All the afternoon, a faint scum of cloud had covered the sky and divided the sunlight. All the afternoon, a dull smudge of fog rested on the southern horizon, and the sun dropped from sight into a bank of yellow-brown clouds. The bay was calm, but the small craft lying windbound there rose and fell uneasily to the swell that served to underrun the surface. The night fell at low water, but as the tide rose, it brought the wind with it and the fog, and the waves began to burst with a threatening roar against the rocks. Till midnight, the wind grew slowly and steadily stronger. Then it veered to the eastward, blowing in from open sea and making the shelter of the harbor of no avail. Dawn showed nothing but fog, the wind moaning through it with a strange, ghostly sound. The fog seemed to shut one in with the wind, deprived of the sense of sight. One's whole faculties became concentrated in that of hearing. And the wind, howling through the invulnerable curtain of fog, grew to have a menacing, almost human voice. Before long, however, the rain came with a rush and the fog blew clear, showing the ugly gray of the water streaked landward with long lines of white foam and the anchored schooners riding heavily head to the sea. On the wharf below was gathered a knot of small black figures, watching with strained attention the plunges of the little craft, some of them doubtless seeing their savings of years imperiled. But as yet there was no change in the position of the little vessels. They seemed to be riding it out bravely, and as it drew toward noon, the wind began to blow more fitfully, and rain came once more in torrents. This was the breaking of the short-lived gale, and by the second nightfall, the only remaining trace of the recent commotion of wind and water was the great swell that still rolled in and broke heavily along the ledges, happily bringing with it this time no bones of ships. I find it fascinating to think, so she spent most of her life at sea, and now she's inland at Orono, and she's trying to deal with a whole new lifestyle. And several of these college essays relate to topics of life at sea. And they really start that what she did her whole life of keeping records and writing about sea. And it's fun too, because since it's a college essay, we have what her professor thought of her essay, which was pretty good. The connotation is excellent. It makes us see, hear, and feel, and thus the writer's purpose is accomplished. So I thought, I can imagine that scene happening right out here on the bay. And hopefully that's what you were picturing as well. So Joanna continued her studies at the University of Maine and went on to get her master's degree as well. But by 1909, she was reconsidering what to do with her life. We only have Lincoln's side of this conversation, but we see that Joanna is grappling with big questions and big life decisions. And so this is Lincoln writing. And he says, "A while ago, you were obsessed by the fear that you were incapable of love. That was the first awakening, as it were. We have our past to blame for having been placed in this horrible and introspective position, but we have both won that. You never will fear that again. Well, you contemplate a marriage without love from a sense of duty. I don't think you have it settled yet. Such a thing is impossible for you. Your life would be a burden. God does not ask us to do these things, and if we do them out of a mistaken sense of duty, the law judges us, and at the end of life, we find that we haven't really served. No man who is a man would ask a girl to do that for him. It is too big a task for a human heart to carry through. You would not do good. Your children might not comfort you. It's possible. You speak of wrecking his life. I don't think you would. He is not a life that is easily wrecked, for he is secure in a certain egoism. He has not won you anyway, as a man should. You have made him win you. And he goes on and admits that, you know what, it's your decision. But in the abstract, nothing in life can pay or justify a marriage without mutual love. Between serious people, I mean, and you are hardly might be called an adventurous, Nan. So part of the mystery of why do we have Lincoln's letters and we don't have Joanna's? And she's grappling with these really serious topics. She is also questioning her faith in God. She's questioning, well, she has that big question, should I marry, should I not marry George? And she's not sure that chemistry really is what she wants to do with her life. So she's in her early mid-20s, and what do you do? Life can be really challenging when you're in your 20s and trying to figure out life. And so in March of 1909, Lincoln responds to a letter from Joanna, and he says, "Dear girl, let me answer your last letter first, and then I want to read over the others which I have saved till now. As soon as I read them again, I will destroy them." And then later on, he says, "And I hope that after all, you'll find it in your heart to marry George at the end of next summer." He kind of goes back and forth on that. She does not end up marrying George. What she ends up doing is moving to New York City. I got slightly ahead of myself, but she ends up moving to New York City and pursued a career in social work. And this proved to be a very promising career for her. And in 1911, she started as assistant secretary of Riverside District at the New York Charity Organization Society. And in 1914, she transferred to the central office where Frank J. Bruno was superintendent. She was very active in the field, and she wrote articles and books and spoke at conferences. But then in our archives, we start to see in the early 20s correspondence about a large collection of chanties and poems by American authors about the sea and naval ballads. So this is one of those letters, and it's from Bill Adams. And he writes, "Well, I shall be very keen to see the book, and I thank you a heap for sending it to me. I fully understand the difficulty as regards chanties. Some of the finest I ever heard came from the spontaneous singing of an old Norwegian sailmaker, Hansen. He was wonderful, white-haired and invulnerable. At the bunt, when the courses came in and the weather had earing at reef down, the way he sang 'Blow the man down' must have sent far-off cathedral bells into jealous pangs." And Bill was a poet, and his poem is included at the beginning of Roll and Go. It's fascinating to see the process come together in the documents. And so here's one of the many letters that Joanna's writing to Lincoln. And she says, "In a few days, I'll be sending the chanties along to you. I'll send some extra score paper, and will you get Uncle Fred to play them over to you? And any that don't sound right to you, get him to copy and write down as you remember them." So Uncle Fred was Fred Sweetser, and he was an accomplished musician who taught music in Connecticut. And he returned to the family home in Searsport for summer vacations. And then as a side note, he was also a photographer and might have got Joanna interested in photography. But it's fun to see, well, one, that she's asking for Lincoln's help, but knowing that Lincoln doesn't know how to read music or play the piano, he has to go over, talk to Uncle Fred, see how it's sounding. And then if it's not right, then get Uncle Fred to write down the correct notation. And Joanna had to learn musical notation to do this project. She apparently did not know how to at least write music, maybe read music before this. So let's see. Then we're just going to look at some of this correspondence that is happening. So she gets a letter from Clifford W. Ashley in 1923, and he has thoughts about how to spell shanty. And basically, at least half of the people that she's communicating with have thoughts about how to spell shanty. And he includes a verse and a bibliography of sea shanties. So here's this little bibliography. And if the name maybe sounds familiar, it's because he was the author of the Ashley Book of Knots. And so she responds to him. We have this back and forth. And it includes her thoughts on spelling shanty. And it also includes, on the second page, she talks about going to New Bedford in September to dig through the files there. So how is she collecting sea shanties? She's digging through published, written down collections. And to do that, she's asking her friends and Lincoln's friends, so all these maritime historians and authors, asking them, where do I find this information? What do I need to read? And then she's finding it and reading it, going to the library, getting it. She's spending time at the historical societies, in the library archives. She's digging through broadsides. So the written record. Then she's also writing letters to people who might know some and asking them to write down those verses for her. She's going out and collecting oral history, or collecting recordings herself, listening to people sing and writing down what they're singing and getting the notation down. She's traveling all over doing this, and she's communicating with top experts, which it's pretty cool. Maybe I've been doing this, I'm too deep into this, but I'm like, oh, this is so cool. So here's a progress report to Lincoln in, I think, July of 1923. And she says, not much progress to report this week. I spent several hours yesterday in the New York Historical Society Library going over broadsides. The Massachusetts Historical Bulletin, which Morrison wrote of lists only Massachusetts publications. I found quantities of others put out by New York firms. They're very poor stuff poetically, music hall parodies to popular tunes mostly. And then she also says that I had a nice letter from Clifford Ashley, which I'll enclose. Please be sure to return these original letters as soon as you can. I've subscribed to Sea Stories and been over their back numbers. I've also got the Lubbock book, a dandy, which you'll want to read, the China Clippers. There's little or no shanty material, but a good deal about early American clippers. Actually, a good amount of their correspondence is books that they feel each other should read, whether they're maritime or not, or they're just like life philosophies that they're trading. So then we get, so remember, she's collecting sea shanties, she's also collecting poems. And we get this letter from Brentano's. In reply to your letter of the 18th relative to using certain poems by Harry Kemp in a forthcoming volume, we are willing to grant permission, but should not some sort of payment be made for the sake of the author? And we see a little more of Joanna's personality in her response, which was, gentlemen, I scarcely know how to reply to your question in yours of October 30th. Would it not be better to take it up with Mr. Kemp himself? As I told you, he gave his permission readily and expressed pleasure that his poems were wanted for the collection. As you know, an anthology of this type is not a lucrative proposition, and it is with me a labor of love, so that if payment were requested for much of the material, I should have to give it up. So far, payment has been requested in only one instance, and that was for extracts from the works of Walt Whitman. This one's a little bit harder to read. Now we're into February of 1924. And Joanna got a letter from Addison Woolsey Bronson in Titusville, Pennsylvania. and he had seen an ad about her upcoming book in the periodical Sea Stories. And in response, she says to him, "Since I wrote to Sea Stories, it has been about decided to publish the Chanteys with words and music in a separate volume and defer the volume of seagoing poetry for another 6 months. I'm quite pleased with this decision, as it will mean less outing to both parts." And then she later discusses the challenges of finding the author of determining if there is no author of a sea shanty. But this is where we finally see it spelled out, like why was it not this 3-part anthology? It's just the one that ends up getting printed. So as part of her research, Joanna visited with residents at Sailor's Snug Harbor on Staten Island. And one of her regular interviewees was Harry Perry, a distant Searsport cousin by marriage. And this is a postcard that Harry had sent to Joanna after one of their talks. And here is the view of Sailor's Snug Harbor. Oh, one more thing about Harry Perry. So he's acknowledged in the acknowledgements of Roll and Go. And he also, as it turns out, was first mate on the Mabel I. Myers in 1892, which doesn't mean a lot to many people, but we have a puppet cat who's our ambassador for young learners, and he's based on a real cat that was on that voyage. So when I saw Harry Perry as part of the Joanna story, it was really cool to see these connections. These Searsport people just pop up all over the place. So now we're back to 1924 and Roll and Go. But the publication of Roll and Go was not the end of the shanty work. Joanna immediately began receiving questions, reviews, ideas, and more shanties that people thought should have been included. For example, Louise Pound sent a letter to Joanna, and this is actually a follow-up letter. But Louise Pound is a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she studied linguistics and folklore with a focus on ballads. She wrote this letter in 1926, thanking Joanna Colcord for an inscribed copy of Roll and Go Songs of American Sailormen. And along with the thank you, she also sent a song that maybe Joanna would be interested in at the very least. And it's about the Benjamin F. Packard, which was launched in Bath, Maine in 1882. And Joanna corresponded with Louise with questions about shanties. And it's an example of how Joanna sought expert advice and also traveled extensively. Stepping away from shanties for a moment, I want to briefly mention several other maritime projects that Joanna worked on. She was interested in sea terms in shore speech and words that have migrated from sailors into landlubbers and how they are used. So she presented this document to the Penobscot Marine Museum, which was started in 1936. And she presented this in 1943. And later, 2 years later, she published this is okay. She published Sea Language Comes Ashore. So this is pages from the master copy of that, which was published in 1945. This is from a letter from Lincoln, and it's earlier, but it works here, where he suggests that Joanna needs to subscribe to a clipping bureau. And I wasn't completely sure what a clipping bureau was, but it's basically a Google alert today. But the cool part is we have pieces of this in the scrapbook. So these are all clippings after Sea Language Comes Ashore was published. So the clipping bureau clips them out and sends them to Joanna so she doesn't have to buy all the newspapers and keep looking for her name. And it's pretty cool to see how far away this was covered, all over the US. And we have pages of these. She also had an interest in cabins, in the cabins on board ships. And she began, well, she realized that nobody else had collected these. So of course, then it's her job to collect them. So again, she was corresponding with people, kept collecting images, pictures, diagrams, descriptions of what a ship's cabin would look like. So this one is the plan of the after cabin from the ship's State of Maine. And Joanna was on the first voyage, and she drew this and sent it home so that her brother could know what the cabin was like. Which I don't know if that's nice or if she's like taunting him that he doesn't get to be there with them. Because it goes both ways. When in their writing, they're both like really supportive and really nice to each other, but also really critical and sometimes a little bit mean to each other. It's easy to forget when we're going through all of this stuff that Joanna actually had a full professional career beyond this, because that all sounds like a full-time job to me. But that was her spare time. And in her professional life, she was a social worker. And she was mostly working in New York City. She spent some years in Minneapolis. But in 1920, she led a group down to the Virgin Islands and helped to establish nursing schools and libraries there. And she maintained that interest in the Virgin Islands and went back there again. So this is in the 30s, in 34, and President Roosevelt has appointed her for a member of the advisory council for the governing of the Virgin Islands. So we were conducting our research again the other day, and we're excited to find a presidential signature in the collection. So what happens to Joanna? Unfortunately, actually, even right before she was able to publish Sea Language Comes Ashore, in the summer of 1944, she likely had a stroke and became paralyzed on half of her body, and she couldn't speak for a very long time. And Lincoln ended up stepping in to help get that book published. And her recovery was very slow and very difficult, and she ended up having to retire because she couldn't return to work. And then Lincoln ended up dying a few years later, but then in 1950, she got married for the first time. And she married Frank Bruno. They'd been friends for years. And this letter is Joanna asking her nephew Brooks if he would walk her down the aisle. Would you like to stand up with me and give the bride away in the good old fashioned? So that's generally the end of my talk, but I have one bonus before we launch into questions. So I was telling you about how Lincoln was wandering around Searsport. You imagine he was being polite and asking people to see their living room and what paintings do you have. And he had found these ones, and he was asking Joanna in letters, well, how do we get these photographed in a way that they're going to be able to reproduce in print? And they went back and forth on it. And then finally we have this telegram from Lincoln to Joanna, like, hey, will this work? And then Joanna responds with this telegram, no, you have to do it this way. And the telegrams are pretty rare, at least the ones that were saved, but it's just a really interesting thing about how collaborative they were working from these distances and how dedicated they were to the job that they were doing. Well, then I guess we can wrap it up. Thank you again for joining us on Zoom and in person. It was very fun to chat with you guys. And if you do have further questions, you can reach out by email or come visit the museum, because we do have this year 3 exhibits relating to Joanna. We have in this room, we have Faithfully Yours, Joanna C. Colcord, which is a biographical exhibit. And we also have a music exhibit that starts with Joanna's sea shanties and then expands to look at the role of music for Mid-Coast Mainers in the past and today. And we have a photography exhibit that looks at when you're 18 years old and you're traveling on your father's ship, what do you take pictures of? And we have 3 images from both Joanna and Ruth Montgomery, who's a Booth Bay ship's captain's daughter. And we merge it with today by giving it a social media vibe. I also forgot to mention, this is all based on our really fabulous archives. Great place to do research, really cool stuff in there. And if you are interested in doing research in our library, just send Sipperly an email. She's our curator, Sipperly Good, and she can set you up with an appointment. And I think that's it. Okay.